Blog Talk Radio.
Hi, thanks for joining us on Resilience Radio, where we explore the art and science of thriving in a turbulent world. I'm your host, Dr. Linda Hoops. If you're listening to this show live and have a question or comment, we'd love to have you call in at 347-826-7314. That's 347-826-7314. You can find additional episodes on the web at blogtalkradio.com/resilience-radio. Good afternoon. Today we are going to talk about infertility, a challenge that more people face than you might think, something like 10% or more of women in the U.S. and as many as 1 in 4 women worldwide. But it's not just the women who deal with this issue. It affects their partners as well. So today I'm pleased to welcome both Heather and Dan Smith here to share their story. Welcome, guys.
Hi, Linda.
Hi, Linda. Thanks for having us.
Hey, my pleasure. Well, so I'd like to start at the beginning. Tell me a little bit about how you guys met and how the whole challenge of infertility arose in your relationship.
I'll field this one. So Heather and I met. We were both in our mid-30s, and I was living north of New York City, about an hour north of New York City. I'm an Army officer, and I was a faculty member at West Point and was teaching psychology at West Point. And Heather was a marketing executive in New York City, and she had moved to be close to her sister, whose husband was in my department. And so my husband used to, my now brother-in-law used to say, hey, you have to meet my sister-in-law. And after resisting for a while, I said, okay, show me a picture. And I saw the picture and said, oh, absolutely, I'll meet your sister-in-law. But then she didn't want to meet me for probably reasons of appearance as well.
No.
But I eventually wore her down, and we had a date on Valentine's Day. We went swing dancing in New York City, and we're married less than a year later. So,
Absolutely. I honestly didn't believe marriage or children were in my cards. It just wasn't for me. I loved my career and sort of followed that path for a long time until in my 30s I realized it would be wonderful to have a family, but finding the right partner was probably a big challenge. And so I didn't really even think about children because I felt like until I found the right partner, it just wasn't going to happen. And then my brother-in-law brought me Dan, and then I realized how much I wanted to grow our family and have children with Dan.
Yeah. So, and we had decided, we had talked about a family, and really from the moment we got married, we were in the process of trying to have a family. So it probably within those first 6 months is when we first started to suspect that we might have an issue with infertility. And that's especially with us being our mid-30s, Heather at that point being over 35, we had decided to go see a doctor just to be proactive.
Absolutely. I had met so many people that said they didn't know what was wrong or they weren't sure, and I thought I really need answers. Infertility, I guess, is defined as the inability to conceive after 1 year of unprotected intercourse. But if you're over 35, they suggest going and asking for answers really after about 6 months. And so that is what we did. And what was most interesting at that point was having no clue what we were about to, sort of this odyssey that was launching for us. I never thought it would be a problem for me. My cousin was my age and got pregnant on her honeymoon, and we just thought it would be this thing that was about, the next progression in our relationship was family. So we went to a first doctor. And this was a challenge because this first doctor basically ran tests and said, you're fine. She said, you are underweight. And at the time it made no sense considering I was a size 6 woman and weighed 125 pounds. And so Dan and I kind of figured at this point, this is going to be an unusual learning experience for us because that just didn't sound right. It was, I think, you have no idea what you're entering because it was so foreign to us. So at that point we realized it was utterly important that we educate ourselves. We had to learn about this disease. We had to learn about what the issues were so that I could better understand when doctors gave me sort of these answers, if they made sense or not.
Mm-hmm.
That doctor, we actually moved, and we were moving to Fort Campbell, and Dan was about to deploy. We found a second doctor, and he was highly detailed, very thorough in his testing of both Dan and myself, and much more competent doctor. At that point was the biggest shock of my life. He said, "You have very little chance of having children with your own eggs." I didn't realize sort of my eggs were pretty much in total failure, but I really wasn't ready to hear that. And so that sort of did start this path where in total we saw 3 fertility specialists. We had 13 fertility procedures. We had many canceled attempts because my body may not be cooperating. It went for 8 years. So we took a really incredible path at that point.
Dan, how was that for you, watching Heather go through all these attempts, being there, being on deployment?
It was hard. I think I don't think you can. I never anticipated how Heather would react to that. That she would struggle really hard with feelings of helplessness and even shame and feelings like she was failing me, and I didn't know how to take that from her. I would have married Heather again, even if we didn't have, even knowing that that we might not have children. That was never even entered my mind. But for her, it was a very tough emotional thing to deal with, and it took us some time to kind of process what we were dealing with, and I think it really helped that we have a great dynamic in our relationship. Is we have an open line of communication, and in this process, we talked about how we were both feeling and how we were feeling right now. What's a viable option given that we're confronting this big challenge in our relationship? How do you feel, and what do you feel is a viable option now? I think in this process there's a lot of bridges to cross, and we kind of crossed each one, handled each obstacle as it presented themselves, and gave each other a chance to change our mind. Because I would never know we would never know unless we communicated how we feel about potential IVF with a donor egg. You think you know that up front, but 2 years later and 3 failed attempts, and you might feel differently.
It was really interesting because I guess my entire life, if I set my mind to something, I'd achieve it. This was a very unusual experience for me to have this feeling of total helplessness, really this failure that I could do nothing to make it better. And so when faced with that, I think I wasn't ready to hear it. When a doctor tells you you really can't have your children with your own eggs, honestly, I don't know if I even wanted to believe it. So with him, we did try 5 artificial, it's called FSP, they're artificial reproductive technologies similar to IUI, which is if you think of the turkey baster intrauterine insemination. We tried 5 and then what we learned, and this was really navigating this crazy minefield with the insurance companies, was there were ways to avoid having to pay the incredible high costs of certain medications and the procedures as long as they didn't include anything artificial. So we learned about timed intercourse, where I needed a tremendous amount of medication to try to get my eggs to grow, and then Dan was coming home on R&R, and we could time that intercourse, and sure enough, we got pregnant. But we miscarried 2 months later. It was great in terms of me then, though, continuing to learn about all these nuances with the health care and what was covered, what wasn't covered, how we could sort of use it to our advantage then to figure out what we could do because the costs were so high. After that miscarriage, I said, let's try IVF, with my own eggs, and after a tremendous amount of money, the doctor begged us, please pull the plug. They couldn't even get one egg to grow. I think at that point we knew, 6 attempts, there was no way my eggs were going to work. So it was very disheartening at that point to reach that crossroad, and we had to really give it great thought and figure out what are our options at this point. And so you never realize how fluid the process is as you go through each of these paths that, okay, I feel differently now than I did at the beginning of this process, and now I'm more open to hearing about options like egg donation. I had never even heard of egg donation. I had certainly heard of sperm donation, but never egg donation. And I think Dan and we did not come to that decision easily, that would be the path we'd choose. And it's a very expensive path. I'm an extreme case in the situation of infertility. There's a lot of middle ground and a lot of people who can easily be treated. I was not one of them. So egg donation for me meant I could experience pregnancy and my child could have Dan's DNA, which at the end of the day, I wanted children with Dan, so that became a real defining factor for me to choose egg donation.
Do you get to choose an egg donor like people talk about choosing sperm donors?
Absolutely. It's like looking at a catalog and going shopping. So it shows medical history, physical traits. They even write about, their personality traits, their lifestyle. It was a very interesting process.
I think if there's a point we might make, too, is how grateful we were to these women who really enabled us to have children and gave us hope and options that so many people never have. In this process, some of a good portion of our struggles took place when I was deployed in Afghanistan, and for us to be a part while managing this process, and when I came home on R&R and we did timed intercourse and Heather got pregnant, and we were on pins and needles for about 2 months, and I remember when I called home and found out that she had miscarried, and then talk about her feeling like she was failing me. I felt like I was failing her because I couldn't be there for her during that process to help her deal with that event. But it was, we made it through that, and over time and communication really had an appreciation for what are our options now, and how do we feel about it, and where are we going to go next.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was very interesting because Dan wasn't with me when I had to choose an egg donor. So we talked about what are those critical points medically. We wanted an egg donor who had great success, all of those things. And when I went in, really there was no one that was a good, a suitable donor. And so I felt very deflated. There are national boards that you can go to where they have donors. There are a lot of options. Some of the fertility clinics have their own, which mine did, and they called me and said, Heather, we now have the perfect person for you. And sure enough, we found our donor, and we created embryos, and our first IVF was a success. So we have a beautiful 4.5-year-old son, and we thought, wow, we have now figured out how this is going to work, and we can go on now to have many more children through IVF.
I think after that first success with IVF with an egg donor, we thought we had cracked the code, and that a second child would be easy to have, and that turned out not to be the case.
You had some additional eggs banked from that donor, right?
Exactly. So they call the first attempt fresh. So basically they've created these embryos from the fresh eggs and Dan's at the time frozen sperm, and the first transfer of embryo is fresh. The rest they freeze. So at that point we froze the remaining embryos. So after about 9 months, I was ready to go again. Now I wanted 5 children. I was very excited. And so we went in and we thought we figured out all of my body chemistry, everything that had to be done. Because I required so much medication, they had the time now after all these failed procedures, though, to figure out exactly how to manipulate my body. So we thought, we know how to do this. So we went through the second IVF, and I think we were all pretty shocked that it failed. And so we had 2 remaining embryos for our third IVF, and again, we're shocked that it failed. So something was happening, and we just didn't know what.
Yeah.
You really had to get familiar with your own body chemistry and rhythms and every little detail that's going on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And there was a time after that third failed IVF where, we kind of went into some introspection and thinking about where we're at, how do we feel, and after a while, we came to the conclusion that we still wanted more children, and given the options to do that, including adoption, which is an option that was always on the table, that was discussed between us. After some introspection, though, we decided that we selected a second donor, and about that time the Army was moving me back to New York, and so Heather had to find a third doctor. She had to, in every state the insurance laws are different, and the doctors are different, and really Heather took the lead for us in figuring out who was the best doctor in the area and how to manage this new labyrinth of insurance bureaucracy, but we eventually found the right person, and
I'll say one thing that was a shock too for me. After all of the embryos were gone and we had no more children, just our son, and we felt so blessed. I think it was a big surprise for me how much sort of negative feedback we got. I don't know how to explain it, but people had a lot of opinions and shared a lot of their thoughts, and they weren't always very sensitive or very kind. And I didn't expect that. So people would say, you really should be happy that you have one child. So it was a very interesting thought where we were more than happy. We were over the moon that we had this child. That's why we wanted more, and we wanted a sibling for our son. And so I think I felt so incredibly alone. I didn't come across one individual in all this time that had gone through infertility. And so the lack of people either talking about it or people going through it was such a surprise to me.
I think it was people not talking about it.
I think so too now. I really do. I think people don't talk about it, and it's such a shame. And a lot of people really don't choose to do anything to, I guess, follow up with a fertility clinic or to see, if they can find answers for what's going on with their own bodies. But I felt totally alone. And when you're getting so much information from people and they're telling you need to relax, you need to leave your job, it's a shame, because I think people are trying to be helpful, but they don't know what to say.
And sometimes people are sort of hamstrung by some dysfunctional beliefs about what they feel. For some reason, they feel like the process of having children should be natural, with emphasis added. And most of these folks, like you and me, are folks that they wouldn't tolerate a headache in a natural way. They're going to go straight to better living through chemistry. But when it comes to having children, they're totally wrapped around with some preconceived notion of natural. When it's a medical condition, for 85 to 90% of the people, is so easily treatable. Our case, I think, is extreme and required a fair degree of persistence and resilience, and we're fortunate that we did persevere and we have such a wonderful family now. But I think for so many people, they don't even try because for various reasons.
Yeah, I met a lot of women who would say, "Oh, my doctor told me everything's fine." I said, "Really? How many years have you been trying?" "Oh, 6 or 7." Something's wrong.
Like, go to the
doctor.
Yeah.
If you had any other condition for 6 or 7 years, you'd probably talk to a doctor.
Yeah.
So it was an interesting philosophy of what natural meant to people, or that they felt childbearing had to be natural.
Or a doctor told them everything was okay. It could have been the guy might have been the last guy in his class. They still call him doctor, but he graduated last, from I don't know what crazy college, but
Yeah, it's a shame. It's
right. Right.
What I finally realized,
school or whatever.
Right. Yeah. What I think people assume, too, is a lot of times you go to your primary care physician and they refer you. They may pick the doctor for you. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, for many years now has monitored and controlled the reporting of success rates from all these fertility clinics. So at your fingertips, you can go on their website and find the success rates by year, and it shows you by category how much success rates are falling in for the IVFs that each of their offices are doing. And it also has to show you fresh versus frozen. And what I didn't realize until moving to New York City with frozen embryos was how critical it was at this point to find a doctor who had really mastered the freezing and thawing process, because some doctors' offices didn't know how to thaw. So if you brought 4 embryos, they might destroy 2 in the thawing process. So I said, I have to find a doctor who knows freezing and thawing. And so that was really important in New York, since we only had 4 frozen embryos remaining. And so we got very lucky that there was a person that was a leader in the field. In fact, he had been one of the leaders in understanding how to freeze women's eggs, where when we started this journey, you still couldn't freeze your own eggs. Now that that's an option, I highly suggest to any woman who's over 30 and may want children to go in and look into freezing your own eggs.
That's really interesting. So I know that you have another chapter to the story. So tell me about what happened after that.
We went in with 4 frozen embryos. I met with the doctor. He saw he looked at everything, and he said, there is no reason you shouldn't be able to get pregnant. And I said, I totally agree. So we worked hand in hand. What was interesting was the very first IVF with this doctor failed. So he said, come in and let's talk about this, because I think for him it was sort of this mystery as well. Why is this failing? And so we really had to dig down. What exactly is going on with my body? Where could things be failing? And so really talking through it and figuring it out, we felt like we had this. He said, you have a very small window of opportunity where that embryo has to implant. And I think we have to monitor you much more closely than we normally would. So it came to my second of 3 transfers, and they checked all my numbers. Everything looked great. He said, we'll do the transfer in 5 days from today. I said, wait, aren't you going to check me again since I have a small window? He said, I think we're okay. And I said, no. So 5 days later, when I went in for the transfer, I said, before you do this transfer, you have to check all my levels, everything, make sure everything's right. And sure enough, when they checked, my endometrial lining had started to fail, and that transfer would have been a total fail if they hadn't checked me before. And so we learned quickly then how critical it was that clearly my body, in terms of certain failures, were happening that they didn't even expect. So by pushing them and really forcing that issue, thank goodness we didn't sort of destroy an embryo unnecessarily.
Yeah, that would have been tragic if we had lost our last embryo, really kind of based on medical incompetence. And it almost goes back to the require to sort of take charge of your own situation and educate yourself. We did that at every turn, and to the point that Heather could understand when things were making sense and could anticipate when they weren't taking when they weren't taking into account her medical history or her knowledge of. She's an expert in her body, and they're an expert in medicine, and they got to work together.
Absolutely. So when I went in, then we prepped my body. We went for the next transfer. Everything seemed perfect. They transferred, and sure enough, I was pregnant, and we were very excited. But you're on pins and needles, and everyone's asking, how are you feeling? How are you doing? And so it was devastating when then we miscarried again at about 7 weeks. So his first transfer was a total fail. Once we really manipulated everything, figured it out, that second transfer I got pregnant, but it miscarried. I had 2 remaining embryos at that point, too. And I told Dan...
This is quite the cliffhanger.
It was, and I think at that point, I always told Dan I would know when I could no longer emotionally or physically do this. It is incredibly difficult. It's taxing on your mind, on your body. I probably had over 1,000 injections. To administer progesterone, I needed 2 large oil injections in my upper hip every day. It's a very exhaustive process. And so after that miscarriage and being in my 40s, I just said, I think I can only do this one more time. So we had 2 embryos remaining, and we said we'll transfer both embryos. And sure enough, we did, and got that call, and they said, you are pregnant with 1 child. And again, you're just on pins and needles with every few days going in and being tested. And each week that passed, and they said, everything looks wonderful. And everything was. And now we have a beautiful 6-month-old daughter named Lillian.
That's a wonderful end to that part of the story. What really strikes me as I listen to it is the balance between taking charge of the situation and being very insistent on how you want things to go, and at the same time recognizing that there are times when you've got to accept reality and back up to the next acceptable option.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was such a fluid process. So you have preconceived notions up front, and really when the doctor told me, you really should consider egg donation, my first reaction was no. I mean, I really believe that's something I would never have considered. And so allow yourself to really explore and understand and think it over, because it's amazing what a process like this, all the information offers, all of these crossroads. You start to really look at things differently when you give yourself a chance to consider these things you may have never considered before.
So as I think about other couples facing a similar situation, when I think about resilience, it's really about figuring out how to thrive in the middle of all this unexpectedness and disruption. And it sounds like you all resulted in an outcome that, despite a lot of ups and downs, was something that you're really pleased with. For some other couples, it seems like they may have to accept an outcome that includes not having children, or they may decide instead to adopt. So it seems like there's a lot of possible outcomes that could be considered successful for people. What do you think are some of the ingredients that make it possible to move through this process more effectively?
I think our dedication to each other was paramount. I think if our outcome had been no children, our life would have been a success. The fact that I would never have regretted marrying Heather, and she would have never regretted marrying me. You talked about several outcomes that could be seen as success, but I think the ability to kind of redefine success for you is important, and always keeping sight of each other. One threat, I think, to people who are enduring this process is losing sight of each other in the process. And
absolutely. Oh, we've seen it happen to a friend of ours. So because it becomes this all-encompassing process, it really does take over a lot of your life. Every turn we had to stop and take a deep breath and remember each other. We had to remember why we wanted to have children so badly, because we loved each other so much. And we never wanted to lose sight of that. And I can see where this process becomes so overwhelming that some people can certainly start to lose sight of each other and only focus on this process. And when the process fails, it is very hard and very painful. And so just remember to hold on to each other.
As we come near the end of our time, I'm curious to hear about how you've taken what you've learned from this and turned around to reach out to others. It sounds like you've talked to other people who are going through similar situations. Tell me a little bit about what you've done along those lines.
Absolutely. I really believe now that life is such a miracle. I love sharing my story. And by talking now to others, it's incredible to me how many women have come forward to me to tell me their own story where they've been afraid or ashamed to talk about it. They haven't gone and looked for help. They're too embarrassed, etc. So we've reached out through blogs. We've reached out to our communities by working through some of the insurance issues, and we have insurance through the military. By working with the doctors located near medical facilities, we've been able to help them understand how to most cost-effectively work with procedures like timed intercourse that have helped now hundreds of these women have children where they otherwise could not have afforded it if they had to go through artificial reproductive technology. So that's been a wonderful, wonderful experience for me, especially in these communities where people may not have the funds that we did because we had 2 careers and we got married so much later in life. We had the money to do it, but the reality is a lot of people may not. It is a very expensive process. So I'm really happy that my story, at least I'm so happy to share it because I hope if it could help anyone, it's a success story in so many ways.
Are there any particular resources you would recommend to people if they're looking for more information on dealing with infertility?
Absolutely. Resolve.org is a wonderful organization. They have tremendous information. They have wonderful support groups. And they are always monitoring and working with, Capitol Hill, the legislation and medical care, and they are doing their best to try to get more and more covered so that women facing infertility are treated as if it is a medical condition and not just some unfortunate situation that's occurred. And so they're a wonderful resource. Also, make sure if you're going to go on the path for needing an endocrinologist or IVF that you are looking at the CDC's websites because they do offer up the annual report on success rates, and that really helps you understand how effectively these doctors are working with IVF. Some doctors have very, very low success rates. The first doctor they wanted to send me to had about a 2% success rate, and so I was just stunned where other doctors, could have up to 75% success rates. So doing your homework, looking at these resources is just a huge help then so that your path is much easier.
Well, I thank you so much for the generosity with which you've shared your story. Do either of you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share?
No, just know that you're not alone if you're out there. There are a lot of women. And so when they say 10 to 12 people probably suffer from infertility, that number is probably a lot higher for all the women who've never come forward or never sought help. So there are a lot of us out there. So I think it's important that we break that silence and really help each other not to feel so alone in this.
Thank you. Dan?
Nothing here.
Okay, all right, great. Well, one of the things that really
Linda.
comes through is your commitment to each other. Yeah, it's been my pleasure. So thank you all who have been listening or are listening to this on demand. Be aware that Resilience Radio is available on iTunes as a podcast. And in next week's episode, we'll be interviewing Brian and Brandon Gorman, a father and son who have an interesting story to tell about how they became a family. So I wish you all a good afternoon.